Among Donald Trump's many immigration proposals is a promise to issue an executive order to end birthright citizenship in America. And yesterday, I asked former acting U.S. Solicitor General Neil Katyal if that was possible. He also promised to sign an executive order on day one to end birthright citizenship in the United States. Can he do that via executive order?
No. Last I checked, the president can't override the Constitution. The 14th Amendment is as clear as day that there is no way he can do that. If he tries that, he will lose in court every day of the week.
Few people know the law better. Neil is, of course, 100% correct about the law. And since birthright citizenship was enshrined into the Constitution with the 14th Amendment, all three branches of government, regardless of the party in power, have consistently concluded that it applies to children born on U.S. soil, children born to citizens and migrants alike. Even Trump-appointed Judge James Ho, a member of the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, whose opinions have at times been too extreme for the conservative justices on the Supreme Court, defended birthright citizenship back in 2006, saying, quote, "Text and history confirm that the Citizenship Clause reaches all persons who are subject to U.S. jurisdiction and laws, regardless of race or alienage." But that was then. And today, that very same judge who wrote that floated a new loophole that will be music to Trump's ears. In an interview with Reason magazine, Judge Ho said, quote, "Birthright citizenship obviously doesn't apply in case of war or invasion." It's quite a broad definition. Joining me now is Sherrilyn Ifill. She is the former president and director counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. She's now the Vernon Jordan Endowed Chair in Civil Rights at Howard University. Sherrilyn, it's so great to see you. I ran into you last week. It's always great to see you, hear your straight talk. Yeah. So Neil was pretty confident that Trump's executive order to ban birthright citizenship openly goes against the Constitution and precedent, and that it, that I would assume you agree with that analysis of the law. The rebuttal I've seen to that is essentially, well, that hasn't stopped some right-wing courts before with loopholes being floated. There was one I just floated from Judge Ho that migrants aren't migrants, but instead foreign invaders. What do you make of the powers? Again, I just was talking to Maura Healey. I don't want to scare anyone, but I want people to be very clear about what's happening here and what people will try to do over the next couple of years. So what do you make of that? And how do you think the judiciary could analyze this with Trump and his administration?
Yeah, I think you're asking the right question, Jen, and thanks for having me on. Neil is absolutely right. The first line of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution is every person born or naturalized in the United States is a citizen of the United States and in the state where they reside. The language couldn't be clearer. It's unequivocal. Birthright citizenship was, created and ratified to ensure that Black people, both free and newly freed, would be citizens after the Dred Scott decision and after the end of the Civil War. That's who it was intended for. But of course, tens of millions of now Americans and their families have benefited from birthright citizenship, including waves and waves of European immigrants in the 20th century. But there has been this continuous call by those on the right and to talk about birthright citizenship as though it is a policy choice rather than a constitutional imperative. And so you're seeing more of that here with Trump believing he can, by executive order, sign it away. I think he knows, and I'm sure that those around him know, that an executive order cannot trump a constitutional provision. What he is counting on is the investment that those on the extremist right have made in the federal courts, including the Supreme Court. And what they are hoping is that what you were describing as a loophole would be reinterpreted by the Supreme Court. The court has been clear in the past, more than 100 years ago, that the loophole that Ho is referring to really was meant to deal with the children of diplomats who are assigned to this country. Those children who are born here are not citizens because the diplomats are not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. They have diplomatic immunity. This has nothing to do with migrants who are born in this country. But the invasion language, that's the important part, Jen. This is the effort to do this mass denaturalization that Trump's right-hand acolyte, Stephen Miller, has talked about. Denaturalization is a process that can happen if there's been some willful misleading or there has been some fraud or some other criminal activity that made someone not really eligible for naturalization who was naturalized. But it's used in time of war. It is not used in time of peace. But because there is also this loophole in that statute, that 1798 Alien Enemies Act, that talks about invasion or predatory incursion, that is what they have been building up to. That's been the reason for the migrant talk. That's been the reason for the, they eat the pets. All of this has been laying the foundation to try and get the Supreme Court to see the migrants coming from Central America and from South America to see that as an invasion of some kind, to see that as a kind of predatory act. There's going to be an effort to talk about gangs. This goes back to Aurora, Colorado. This is why Trump said he's going to start his process in Aurora, the effort to suggest that gangs have taken over apartment buildings. This is all an effort to lay the foundation for the concept that we are somehow being invaded by migrants. You've heard many on the right use that language, that this is a predatory incursion. And I would love to be able to tell you that the Supreme Court would reject that out of hand. I want to tell you that, but frankly, I can't tell you that. I would just recall for people that, the most famous use of the Alien Enemies Act was the Japanese internment. Now, the Supreme Court has said that the Korematsu decision was overturned in the court of history. There is no such thing as a court of history. It has not been overturned in the United States Supreme Court. And so I think we should worry, and I think we should be concerned. I know that the American Civil Liberties Union and other immigration organizations are ready and have been preparing for this for years because they take it very seriously. But I think this is going to be the effort to try to get this up to the Supreme Court and hope that the Supreme Court will step far out of line and far away from history and tradition, the history and tradition of birthright citizenship, and make some effort to read the Alien Enemies Act in a way that was clearly not intended by Congress. This is all part of the effort of this administration, this incoming administration, to show itself to be more powerful than our Constitution. And the only way they can do that is with the acquiescence of our federal courts and the United States Supreme Court. So everything that Trump says he is planning to do really is a test for our courts and for the Supreme Court. And I think all of us, given what's happened in the last few years, have reason to be concerned.
Thank you for that amazing explanation. I don't know how everything is in your head, but I think it's so important for us all to be informed right now. And hopefully all these things don't happen, but let's be informed about it.
Yeah.
Let me ask you, this is obviously just one of the areas in which Donald Trump is trying to test the system. And I want to ask you about another, because right now Trump is demanding that Republican senators who want to be majority leader, the election is a silent ballot, it's this week, support recess appointments for his nominees, which is basically a way, for presidents to bypass Congress, to get their people in place. It's a process. It's been used in the past, just to be clear. And it looks like Trump is also going to have a fairly comfortable majority in the Senate. But I know this caught your attention, and I don't want to let anything slip by for what people should understand. So why did it catch your attention, and why is it something that you're concerned about?
Well, once again, as you pointed out, Jen, it looks like President Trump is going to have a comfortable majority in the Senate to be able to get his cabinet confirmed. That's not good enough for him. Because what he doesn't want is to go through the process of confirmation hearings in which Democratic senators will have a chance to expose the inadequacies and extremism of some of the nominees that he is planning to put in his cabinet. So what he wants is to have those positions filled by recess appointments. Recess appointments are temporary appointments for a year, and they're usually used after someone has been through the process for a very long time and the Senate is in a logjam. This preemptive effort to install cabinet members by recess appointments, this is a Trump feature. And this is because Trump does not want that exposure of the kind of people that he is going to nominate. So that's number one. Number two, what he wants is, again, to flex against the constitutional order. The constitutional order is that the president nominates and the Senate has the power to confirm. That is a power that the Senate holds as part of the Constitution. Trump is placing himself above the Constitution. This is the ultimate authoritarian move to say that I am more important, I am more powerful than this document that you all revere. And the more he gets away with it, the more he hopes to cow those around him. Already, he's made this a condition for anybody wanting to be Senate Majority Leader. And of course, he has his right-hand person, Elon Musk, helping him with this. So this is a dangerous move. And it's designed to make us believe that he is the ultimate authority.
I never thought about the piece of not having them questioned. That's such an important point of confirmation processes. Sherrilyn Ifill, thank you so much. It's great to see you. Really appreciate you joining us.